The rancher left a candle burning each Christmas. This year someone knocked back. The candle was a tallow stub, same as always. I set it in the window the way my mother had done, the way I'd done every Christmas Eve for going on 23 years, and then I sat down in the chair across from it and watched it burn. That's the whole of the ritual. There's no prayer attached. There's no name I say out loud. I just sit there in the dark with that one small flame between me and the black glass of the window, and I let the night go where it goes, and somewhere around midnight I blow it out and go to bed. Some years I fell asleep in the chair before I got around to blowing it out. Woke up with wax pooled on the sill, and a cold room, and a neck that reminded me I wasn't 30 anymore. Cutter would be at my feet, looking at me the way dogs look at you when you've done something undignified. I'd get up, stiff, and go to bed, and that was Christmas. That's the whole of it. That's the ceremony. A man sitting alone with a candle on Christmas Eve because he doesn't know what else to do with himself, and because stopping felt worse than continuing. I'd been ranching the Oker Creek ground since I was 28 years old. Came out here from Illinois with a wife named Clara and $1,100 and 2 horses that weren't worth what I'd paid for them. I was young enough to think the horses were a bargain and old enough to know better, which is about the worst combination there is. We came out in the spring of 1871 on a wagon with everything we owned on it, and the horses pulling poorly on account of one of them had a soft shoe I hadn't caught before we left. 2 days out of St. Joseph, I was walking beside the wagon cursing myself, and Clara was up on the seat with a hat on, and she said, "Holt, those are the same horses either way, so you might as well ride." I rode, the shoe held, the horses weren't as bad as I thought. Built the house with my own hands and 2 hired men in the late fall of that same year. It was November by the time we'd gotten the land surveyed, and the corner posts in and the logs up, and we were doing the finish work in December with the cold coming through the gaps, and Clara making biscuits in the fireplace because the stove wasn't in yet. She hung curtains before the window glass was even set. She did it because she said a room needed to look lived in before you could live in it properly, and that always made a kind of sense to me that I couldn't have put into words. She just knew things like that, the shape of a thing and what it needed. Clara died in the spring of '79. Fever. Not dramatic about it, she was sick 3 weeks, and then she wasn't there. That was it. I was 36. I was in the middle of calving season, and I had 14 calves on the ground and 6 more coming, and 2 of the cows were in trouble, and I had to keep working because the cows wouldn't wait, and I worked. And I came in one evening and Clara was gone. I thought that was the worst thing that was going to happen to me. I was right mostly, but being right about a thing doesn't make it useful. It just means you can say later that you knew, and what good is knowing? I kept ranching. What else was there? I had the land and the cattle and the debt and the years of work I'd put in, and what you do with grief when you're a working man is you work. You put it in the ground with your hands and you keep going, and after enough years you don't think about the grief exactly, you just think about the work. The grief becomes part of the texture of the day the way your own pulse is part of the texture. You stop noticing it until something reminds you, and then it's there, and then you go back to work. I had hands come and go. Decker was with me nearly 8 years, a quiet man from Kentucky who could read a cow the way some men read a newspaper, and who left in '89 when his brother sent for him from California. I didn't hear from him after that. There was a boy named Prout who worked 2 summers and was gone, and an older man named Cobb who I had one bad winter with, and then we parted without hard feelings, and then a run of shorter stays. The land itself was constant. The valley and the creek and the hills to the north that went pale with snow in November and held it until April, that was constant. Everything else moved around it. I was not a man who cultivated friendships in town. I went in when I needed to, which was maybe once a month in summer and less in winter. I knew the people I needed to know and was polite to them, and I didn't pretend to more than that. There was a woman named Hendricks, Margaret Hendricks, who who owned the dry goods with her husband, and she tried twice in the first years after Clara to introduce me to this woman or that one, and I was civil about it both times and nothing came of it. And after the second time Margaret let it alone, which I was grateful for. I didn't want introducing. I didn't want anything. The candle was Clara's custom. She'd set one in the window every Christmas Eve, said her mother had done it in Ohio, said it meant there was room at the table. Come in if you're cold. Come in if you're hungry. There's a light here and the door's not locked. She said the old meaning of it was for travelers on the road who needed shelter and couldn't find it, and the candle was to say, here's a house, here's a welcome. I don't know that I believed in that kind of meaning by the time I took it up alone, but I kept doing it because her hands had done it, and because the window looked wrong without it, and because a man needs something to do on the long nights that isn't drinking. I tried the drinking for a while. The winter of '79, after Clara went, I was pretty serious about it for a few months. I didn't become a drunk. I want to be clear about that. I became a man who drank too much and knew he was doing it and kept going anyway, which is a specific kind of stupid that I wasn't able to see out of from the inside. Decker let it go on longer than he should have, and then one morning in March he came in before breakfast and said, I need to tell you something. And I said, go ahead, and he said, you're drinking like a man who wants to die, and I don't believe that's what you want, but I can't keep watching it. I didn't say anything for a while. I looked at him. He was sitting across from me at the table, same place I'm sitting now, more or less with his hat off and his hands flat on the table, being straight with me because that was who Decker was, a straight man. I said, you're right. And that was it. I poured the rest of the bottle out the back door that morning and I didn't replace it, and I didn't drink like that again. I still had a glass of whiskey on evenings I wanted one. That's not the same thing. But that was the winter I started leaving the candle in the window. Not consciously, not as a decision I made and announced to myself. I just did it the first Christmas after Clara was gone because the window needed it, and I kept doing it. 23 years of burning, a candle for a woman who couldn't see it. The year I'm telling you about was 1902. I was 59 years old and I had not expected anything unusual from Christmas Eve. I had not expected anything at all. You get to a certain point in a life and the unexpected becomes something you've mostly stopped waiting for. The unexpected had come years ago and it had gone, and what was left was the work and the land and the particular quality of the light in late October when the grass goes yellow and the hills go brown and the sky over the valley is the color of a tin cup. I had made a life out of noticing those things. Not a bad life, I'll say that plainly. Not what I'd imagined it would be when I drove those horses out of Illinois, but a life. The cattle were in good shape. The hay was stacked, a little more than I'd expected to have, because we'd had good cutting weather in September and I'd gotten a third cut off the south meadow that I hadn't counted on. The barn roof had held through the first snow, which was more than I'd expected given what the north side had looked like in October. I'd patched it in November, and the patch had held. The small things that constitute doing all right when you're a man alone on a working piece of ground. I had a dog named Cutter, a black and brown cattle dog of no particular breeding who was 7 years old and beginning to slow down, and who slept under the table in the evenings and had opinions about strangers. I had a cat with no name who slept in the barn and wanted nothing from me except to be left alone, which I respected. And I had a hired hand named Foss, Wesley Foss, 24 years old, from a farm family in Nebraska, who'd come west 2 years before and found his way to my valley by a combination of luck and necessity that he'd told me about one evening, and I'd mostly forgotten. Foss was capable. I want to say that first because he'd become the kind of person I counted on, and I don't say that about people easily. He was 24 and he still had the careless corners that come with 24, but he worked hard when there was work, and he was honest about what he didn't know, and he'd learned quickly what the place needed. He'd gone into town 2 days before Christmas, and sent word by way of the Hendricks boy that he'd be back the 2nd of January. I told the boy to tell him fine, because there wasn't much that couldn't wait, and because I remembered well enough what it was to be 24 and have somewhere to go at Christmas. So on Christmas Eve of 1902 I was alone, which was not unusual, and I lit the candle at dusk. I lit it with a match from the box on the mantel, and set it in the window the way I always did, in the small iron holder Clara had brought from Ohio, and I stood there a moment looking at it the way you look at a thing you've done so many times it's half a dream already. The flame moved once from a draft and then steadied. Outside the window the yard was white, snow had come down thin and steady all afternoon, and the corral fence was capped, and the whole world past the glass was dark and still and white. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey. I sat down in the chair across from the window. The fire in the stove had settled to a good bed of coals. The lamp was low because I didn't need much light for sitting. Cutter had arranged himself under the table with a sigh that communicated something about the night, too cold to do anything else, might as well sleep. I understood him. I sat there, the whiskey went slowly, the candle burned. I thought about Clara, which I usually did on that night, not with the sharp edge it used to carry that had dulled over the years the way everything dulls. The grief had become a kind of companionship almost. Not the grief exactly, but the habit of her, the way she'd hung those curtains. The sound she made when she was pleased with something, a small sound low in her throat. The set of her shoulders when she was determined, and the different set when she was at rest. I'd carried those things for 23 years without looking at them directly, the way you carry a lamp without staring into the flame. I was thinking about the curtains of all things. She'd hung them before there was glass in the window, and they'd blown in the wind that first week, and she'd laughed and said, "Well, they give the room character." And I'd laughed, which I did more than, and said, "Character and a draft both." And she'd said, "That's all any room needs." It was a small memory. Not the important ones, not the day we married, not the day she told me she was carrying our first, not the last morning. Just curtains in a window with no glass in it, blowing in a November wind, and her laughing. Those are the ones you keep, the small ones. The whiskey was gone. I should have gotten up to put more wood on the stove, but I didn't want to move. The room was warm enough. The dog was asleep. The candle was burning low. I was likely going to fall asleep in the chair, same as some other years, and wake up with wax on the sill and a stiff neck, and that would be Christmas. And then someone knocked on the door. I sat there for a moment and didn't move, because my mind took a beat to accept that the sound had actually happened. A knock, 3 of them, deliberate and spaced. Not frantic, not the sound of someone in immediate distress, hammering to be let in. 3 knocks measured, the way a person knocks when they've got somewhere else to be if you don't answer. I got up. The Colt was on the shelf by the door out of habit, not fear, though in 1902 you still didn't open a door on Christmas Eve without knowing where your iron was. The habit had been there so long I didn't think about it anymore. I took the Colt down and held it at my side, not raised, and I looked at the door for a moment, and then I opened it. A woman. She was standing about 3 feet back from the threshold, which I noticed because most people press up to a door when they knock, in cold weather especially, but she'd given herself room. Like she'd thought about how a man alone might react to a stranger at his door after dark, and had decided to give him the space to think. That told me something, that 3 feet. She had a coat that was too thin for December and a canvas bag over one shoulder and a hat pulled low. Both were dusted with snow. Her hair was dark with some gray in it, hard to tell in the low light. Her face was, I'd say 45, but I've been wrong about a woman's age before, and it didn't especially matter. What I saw was a face that had been through weather and hadn't apologized for it. Straight lines, dark eyes, a mouth that wasn't unfriendly, just not performing anything. She wasn't afraid of me, that was clear. She'd looked at the Colt, and then she'd looked at me, and she hadn't stepped back or changed her expression. "I saw the light," she said. I didn't say anything right away. I was taking stock of her the way you do, not unkindly, just carefully. No horse that I could see, which meant she'd come on foot from somewhere. Nearest somewhere was Dellard's place, 4 miles east, or the road south, which was 3 miles. She didn't look injured. She didn't look drunk, which was the more likely explanation for a woman alone on foot on Christmas Eve. She looked cold and tired in the way of someone who'd been moving a long time, and was nearly done moving for the day. "The candle," I said, not a question. "In the window," she said. "Yes." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. It was a working shift, automatic. Someone used to carrying weight. "I've been walking since about 2 this afternoon. I wasn't going to make it to town tonight, and I'm not going to freeze in a ditch on Christmas Eve if there's a light on somewhere." That was a practical statement. Nothing theatrical in it, no pleading, no appeal to sympathy. She'd assessed her situation, determined her options, and acted on them. I respected that for being what it was. I stepped back from the door. "Come in," I said. She came in. Her boots were caked and she stopped inside the threshold and looked down, and I said, "Don't worry about it. Come in from the cold." She came in properly then. Cutter lifted his head from under the table and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was a moment of mutual assessment. Then Cutter put his head back down. He's a dog with opinions about people, and his opinion of her appeared to be acceptable. She stood just inside the door and looked at the room, not nosily, not making an inventory or calculating the worth of things, just orienting herself, the way a careful person does when they walk into a space that isn't theirs, taking in the layout, the exits, the fire. Then she looked at the candle in the window. "There's heat from the stove," I said, "but I should put more wood on it." "I can do it if you tell me where the box is." "Beside the stove on the left." She crossed to the stove and did it without making a production of it. 2 pieces of good hardwood placed right, not thrown. She knew what she was doing with a stove. I watched her a moment while her back was turned, and then I put the colt back on the shelf. I put water on to heat. I cut bread, 2 days old, a little hard, but it would soften in the heat, and got out some salt pork and set it to warm in the pan. The food wasn't much, but it was what I had that I could put on the table quickly, and she didn't say anything about what it was, just sat down when I told her to. She ate steadily, not greedily. The way someone eats when they're genuinely hungry but have been hungry before, and know how to eat slowly when they've found food, because eating slowly is what a body that knows lean times does. I didn't watch her eat. I sat at the other end of the table with a second glass of whiskey I'd poured, because the bottle suddenly seemed like less of a solitary object with another person in the room, and I looked at the candle. Cutter had relocated from under the table to beside the woman's chair. He did this quietly without fanfare, just moved himself and laid down beside her and put his chin on his paws. She reached down without looking, still eating, and put her hand on his side. Flat-palmed. One slow stroke. He didn't flinch. Dogs tell you things. "Holt Varner," I said. She looked up. "Nora Ends." She said it simply, like she'd been asked, without offering more. We sat a while in a silence that settled easily enough. The fire popped once. Cutter sighed. The candle was nearly to the nub by now, and the flame was smaller. "Is it a custom?" she said. She was looking at the candle. "My wife's custom," I said. "She's been gone 23 years, I still do it." She nodded. Not with pity. I'm particular about pity, and I watched for it, and it wasn't there. She nodded like a person nods when something makes sense to them. "My husband's been gone 6, she said. "I don't have a custom yet, I probably should." She'd offered it level, the way I'd offered mine. An exchange of equivalence between people who don't make a habit of talking about such things but understand the courtesy of it. I accepted it as that. I didn't say I was sorry. She hadn't said it like she wanted that. "Where were you headed?" I said. "West," she said. "Eventually. I've been moving mostly west for about 3 months." "From where?" "Nebraska. I had a farm there, had to sell it." No bitterness in it, no looking away. My husband left debts I didn't know about until after. Not unusual, apparently. I paid what I could and sold the rest. What's west? A sister in Oregon, maybe. She shifted in the chair. We weren't close, but she's what I have. That's a long walk. I have money for the train. I'm just not ready to use it yet. That made sense to me. I didn't ask her to explain it because I didn't think it needed explaining. Sometimes you need the walking. Sometimes getting somewhere too fast means you arrive before you've gotten ready to arrive, and then you're standing in someone else's life still wearing the shape of the old one, and that doesn't do anyone any good. I showed her the spare room. It had been Clara's sewing room and then for several years a working room for whatever hand I had, and now it was just a room with a cot and a chest and a window that looked out toward the creek. Clean enough. Cold. I told her I'd get the little stove in there going, and she said, "Don't bother. I've slept colder." And I said, "Well, there's extra blankets in the chest." And she said, "Thank you," the same way she'd said everything else, plain. No performance. I blew out the candle at midnight, the way I always did, and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark and listened to the snow against the north side of the house, and the particular quality of silence that comes from a house that has another person in it. I hadn't heard that silence in a long time. It's different from the silence of an empty house. I can't explain it except to say that it has a weight to it, a small weight, the way a room with a lamp burning in it weighs more than a dark room. I lay there and listened to it and fell asleep faster than I usually did. She was up before me. I don't sleep late, haven't since I was young, and I was never particularly late then. But when I came out of my room at first light, she was already in the kitchen with the fire up and the coffee on. She'd found the eggs and the pork, and there was a pan on the stove. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I don't mind." She put coffee in front of me and then she sat across with her own cup. We had breakfast. After a while she said she'd head out once she'd eaten if the snow had eased. I looked out the window. It hadn't. The sky was the flat gray of more snow coming. "Give it a few hours," I said. "The road south will be better once the morning clears, if it clears." She looked out the window. "If it doesn't." "Then you stay another day." She nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside the snow came down in the kind of steady, silent way that meant it had been at it all night and wasn't done. After breakfast I went out to tend to the stock. I wasn't going to ask her to stay in the house, and I wasn't going to ask her to help. She was a traveler waiting out weather, not a hired hand. But when I got my coat on and my hat, she put her coat on too. Her coat was still damp from last night and thin for the cold, and she put it on without comment and pulled her hat down and followed me out. I looked at her, she looked at me. "You don't have to," I said. "I know," she said. She went with me to the barn. I watched how she moved around the cattle, which told me most of what I needed to know. She didn't approach them fast. She didn't talk loud. She came to them at an angle, not straight on. And when one of the younger cows turned to look at her, she went still and let the cow look and then moved again, only once the cow had decided she wasn't a problem. That's not something you learn from a book. That's something you learn from years of daily contact with cattle, from making enough mistakes that the mistakes have taught you how not to make them. "You worked cattle before," I said. I was forking hay over the top rail and watching her without making a thing of watching her. "Most of my life," she said. She was at the water trough breaking the skim of ice with the heel of her palm, the way you do when you know the trough is the right depth and the ice is thin enough. "My father ranched near Kearney, beef and some horses. I grew up doing this before I could do most other things." "What'd your husband ranch?" "Corn, soybeans, eventually. He came from farming, not ranching. I never quite got used to the absence of cattle." She said this wryly, just slightly, the first time she'd put anything like humor in her voice. We worked through the morning. The snow eased some around 10 and then came back harder around noon, and by midday it was clear she wasn't going anywhere. She didn't ask if she could stay another night, and I didn't make her ask. I just said, at supper, I'll get more wood for the little stove in your room, and she said thank you. That was the second day. On the third day the snow had stopped, but left behind a covering that was knee-deep in the open ground, and would have been poor walking. She helped again in the morning, same as the second day. And by now we were moving through the barn work with the kind of unstated agreement about who does what that you get between people who have found their tempo together. After the morning work, when we came back in and had coffee, she sat down and was quiet for a little while, and then she said, "Is there work here?" I looked at her across the table. "What kind of work?" "Any kind you need done and can't do alone." I thought about it. I wasn't going to overthink it. The honest answer was yes, there was always work. Foss was one hand and a good one, but one hand is one hand, and a place this size in winter needed more than one pair of hands alongside mine. Things went undone that should get done. I'd been managing without because I'd been managing without for 23 years, and I knew where to cut corners. But corners cut too long have a way of costing you. "There's work," I said. "I can't pay what you're worth until spring when the money comes in, winter wages. Enough to cover my keep and hold what I've got toward the train." "Yes." She nodded, same as always, something decided. "Then I'll stay a bit," she said. She got up and picked up the grain bucket I'd set down by the door and carried it back out to the barn. That was that. Let me tell you something about the shape of that winter. I'd been alone on this piece of ground for a long time, and I'd gotten very particular about how the days ran. Not rigid, rigid is different. Rigid is a man who can't let a day change without it breaking him. This was more like shaped. I'd made the days into a shape I could walk through without having to think about it too hard. Up before light, fire up, coffee, out to the stock, back for breakfast. The day's work in whatever order it came, supper, reading if I felt like it, bed. Same arc day after day, because that's what a working man does with himself when there's no one else there to provide a shape from outside. You build one or you drift. I built one. Nora didn't disrupt any of it. She fit herself into the shape the way water fits a channel. She filled what was there, and she didn't overflow it. She found the rhythm of the place without being told what it was, which meant she either had a similar rhythm herself, from her own years of ranch life, or she was good at reading the room. Either way, she was easy to be around in a way that didn't require me to be anyone I wasn't. We worked together well from the start. I'll say that plainly. There's an ease that two people can find in work that doesn't require them to be friends or to talk much. It's a question of tempo, knowing when to move and when to wait, when to hand a thing over without being asked, when to step back and let the other person finish. We had that without having to earn it through trial and adjustment, which is unusual. Usually you spend a few weeks finding it. With her, it was just there. Foss came back on the 2nd of January like he'd said. He was a good-natured young man, and he took Nora's presence in stride, calling her Mrs. Enns, to which she said just Nora, and after that they got on fine. He liked the company, I think. The place had been just him and me and the cattle for most of the fall, and Foss was young enough to still want more people in his world. The three of us fell into a rhythm, and the days in January ran in that rhythm. What changed for me, what changed, and when it changed, and what it felt like is harder to put into words. It wasn't dramatic. I want to be careful about that. It wasn't the kind of change that announces itself. It was more like, I'd been so long in a house that was only mine that I'd stopped noticing what was missing, the way you stop noticing a sound that's been absent long enough. And then the thing came back, or something like it came back, and I heard the absence for the first time in the moment of its ending. I'd come in from work in the evenings, and she'd be at the stove or at the table, and there'd be a lamp lit. She lit the lamp at dusk, which I usually didn't bother with until full dark, and the room would smell like food. She cooked plainly and well, the way a practical person cooks, the way someone cooks who has spent years cooking for working people who need to be fed. Not elaborate, just good. Salt pork and beans done right is not a small thing, when you've been out in January cold for 4 hours. None of that sounds like much. I know it doesn't. A lamp in the window, a pot on the stove. But after years of coming into a room that was only as lit as I'd left it, and only as warm as the stove had maintained it and smelled of nothing in particular, it was something. It was a thing I hadn't known I was missing until I stopped missing it. I didn't say anything about any of this. It wasn't something to say. She was a woman working her way through winter on her way somewhere else. I was a man who had long since arranged himself to need very little from other people, and was not sure he could remember how to need it, even if the situation allowed for it. In January, about 10 days in, there was a week of hard cold. Not your regular cold, not just below freezing real cold. The kind that kills stock that isn't in shelter and kills men who aren't careful. The kind that comes down from the north in the night, and in the morning the wind has an edge to it that makes you understand very clearly that the world does not especially care about you. Temperatures that would split the wood of a fence post if there was moisture in it. I'd seen cold like that 4 or 5 times in 30 years on this ground, and I knew what it required. We spent 2 days moving the most vulnerable cattle into the south barn, which was the bigger of the 2 barns and which I could heat at both ends with the barrel stoves I'd put in 2 winters before against exactly this eventuality. Every calf, every cow within 3 weeks of calving, every animal that was already showing any sign of weakness. The horses were in the north barn, and the north barn was colder, but the horses had hides and temperament, and more sense about conserving warmth than cattle do. Cattle will stand in the wind and die. Horses have more self-preservation. So the north barn for the horses and the south barn packed with the vulnerable cattle, and fires at both ends. Nora worked those 2 days without a word of complaint. I want you to understand what that means. She worked when it was 20 below and the wind was blowing, and the water in the trough went to ice in the time it took to carry a bucket from the pump to the trough. She worked until her breath was a constant fog, and the skin on her cheeks was the tight white red of someone right at the edge of frostbite, and her hands moved stiffly in the cold because there is a point where gloves stop being adequate to the temperature, and your hands start operating like tools rather than hands, which is to say mechanically, without feeling. She didn't say a word about it. She just worked. I watched her and I said a few times, "Go in and warm up," and she said, "In a minute," and kept working. Not martyr about it, she wasn't performing toughness for my benefit. She just had a thing she considered needed doing, and she was going to do it until it was done. By the end of the second day, the cattle were in and the fires were up, and we'd done everything that could be done. We came back to the house, and I was tired in the bone-deep way of cold work, the kind of tired that sits in your joints and doesn't lift until you've slept. Nora came in behind me, and I looked at her, and something about the way she was holding her right hand was wrong. "Let me see that," I said. "It's fine." I'd heard that before, usually from myself. "I can see it isn't." She looked at me for a moment with that straight-on look of hers. Then she held out her right hand. She'd caught the third finger on the frozen latch of the south barn gate. The latch had seized in the cold, and she'd forced it, and it had let go wrong and torn the skin. Bad tear, deep on the side of the finger and into the palm side of the first knuckle. She'd wrapped it with a strip of her own undershirt and worked the rest of the day with it wrapped. 6 hours, 20 below, a torn finger. I cleaned it and bound it properly. She sat still for all of it and didn't make a sound, which took something because I wasn't gentle. Gentle doesn't disinfect, and I'd seen too many small wounds go bad from being handled tenderly. She sat still with her jaw set and her eyes somewhere else, the way you go somewhere else in your head when something hurts and there's no point in saying it hurts. "You should have said something," I said. "To what end?" "I could have finished alone." She gave me that flat look. "So could I," she said. I couldn't argue with that. She had, and the cattle were in and the barns were warm and the work was done. The finger was the cost of it. She decided the finger was acceptable and done the work. A man who spent 30 years on a working ranch doesn't get to argue with that reasoning. I held her hand for a moment after I'd tied off the bandage, longer than was strictly necessary for the bandage. I'm not sure I made a deliberate decision about that. I just didn't let go right away, and she didn't pull away, and there was a moment of not moving, her hand in both of mine, the fire in the stove putting light on the side of her face. Then I let go and got up and put more wood on the stove, and that was all. In February, Foss went down with a chest cold that put him in bed for 10 days. He was 24 and strong, and he was going to be fine. But while he was flat on his back in his bunk, there were 2 of us doing the work of 3, and that week was the hardest single stretch of that whole winter for me. Nora took on Foss's share without discussion. I don't mean she said, "I'll cover his work," and made a plan and consulted me about it. I mean she woke up on the morning Foss was down and took on what he would have done, added to what she was already doing. She assessed, she absorbed, she worked. I did the same, and between us we covered it. What I remember from those 2 weeks is mostly small things. The sound she made when she was working through something that wasn't going the way she wanted. Not a complaint, not an oath, more like she was quietly talking herself through it. A sound so private I don't think she knew she was making it. A morning she came to the barn while I was setting a calf's leg. The calf had come down wrong trying to get up on ice and had a hairline fracture just above the fetlock. Not catastrophic, but needing the splint. And she sat across from me and held the calf still without my asking her to. One hand at the neck and one at the hip, her weight going into the hold. The calf settling to it the way animals settle to someone who knows what they're doing. She held the calf perfectly still while I worked for 20 minutes, and she didn't shift or adjust or make it harder than it was. I remember she talked to the animals. This was a thing I noticed in those weeks when we were closer together than usual, and I was more observant of her than I would have been otherwise. She talked to them the way I'd seen old hands do and her mother's generation do, not for the animals' understanding, not because she thought they could follow her, but because the voice itself does something. A low, continuous murmur, plain and practical. All right, you're all right, stay still now. There you go. The cattle responded to it. Even Cortez, a bull of mine who had thrown a man 3 years before and who I kept in a separate pen and approached with respect every single time. Cortez would lower his big head when she walked along his fence and hold it down until she was past his reach. I'd never seen that with Cortez. I'd learned to be grateful Cortez tolerated me. February broke into a week of sun, thin sun. Not warm enough to fool you about what month it was, but real sun, the kind that makes the snow crust and turn blue at the shadows and makes the south-facing slopes start to show black earth at the edges. The cattle smelled the change and moved differently, the particular animal restlessness of sensing something better coming even if it isn't here yet. I understand that feeling. I've spent 30 years watching cattle have it in February, and I have always shared it. That week we knocked ice from the barn roof, split wood against the coming mud season. I fixed the corral gate that had been binding since November. Working together in the cold sun, the 3 of us. Foss was back on his feet and thin but working, and the valley white and quiet, and the light particular in the way of late February, where it's not warm but it has an angle to it that's different from January's flat gray. Nora made no mention of leaving. I made no mention of whether she should. I wasn't going to raise it. She'd said she'd stay a bit, and a bit was whatever a bit was. In March I was moving fence line along the creek bottom, the section on the south end of the property that had been pushed by runoff 2 years back, and had needed resetting ever since, and had been on my list for 2 winters. I was working alone that morning. Foss was repairing tack in the barn, and Nora had gone to repair the kitchen garden fence, which the deer had gotten into again over winter. I was levering out a log that had heaved when the creek flooded, frozen into the earth at the base, and I was using a steel bar to break it loose. I'd worked it for 20 minutes when it came free. It came free all at once, the way frozen things do, nothing and nothing and nothing and then all at once. and the end of it came up fast and I stepped wrong and the end of the log caught me across the left shin. 200 pounds of wood. The sound it made was not a sound you want to hear about your own body. I went down. The pain came as a white sheet, the way bad pain does, dropping over everything for a moment so that the world was just white, and then gradually the white thinned and the cold ground came back, and the creak in the fence posts and my own leg. I looked at the leg. It was in one piece. I could feel it was in one piece, meaning I could feel the pain too clearly in too specific a location for it to be a complete break, but it was not all right. I tested it with weight, and it held, but the holding cost something that I paid in sweat despite the cold. I got back to the house using a fence post as a crutch, about 3/4 of a mile. 3/4 of a mile on a leg that didn't want to bear weight in March cold, which takes a while and takes everything you have in terms of concentration, not on the pain but on not going down, on placing the post and placing the foot and moving forward, not on anything else. When I came through the door, my shirt was soaked. Nora was at the table. She was up before I'd gotten the door closed. "Sit down," she said. I sat. She cut the trouser leg with the kitchen knife without asking my permission, which was correct because if she'd asked I would have said it was fine, and she looked at the shin, and her mouth went to a line. That line. The one that meant more than she wanted it to be. It was not a pretty leg. The bone hadn't broken through, I could tell that much, and the leg held its shape, but the shin had taken the blow on the face of the bone, and the flesh there is thin and the swelling was already there and the bruising was deep. What you could see from the outside was not the worst of it. "You need a doctor," she said. "Doctor's 40 miles. I'm aware where the doctor is. That's a day and a half round trip for a bruised shin." She looked at me with that level look, and I knew before she said it that she was right. It's not just a bruised shin, Holt. I said nothing. She was right. But 40 miles was 40 miles and it was March and the mud season was starting and I didn't want to leave the place. "I'll know in 2 days whether it needs the doctor," I said. "If it worsens, I'll go." She held my look for a moment. Then she went and got the boards from the woodpile at the side of the house, 2 straight pieces, and she made a split from them that was better than I would have made myself, and she wrapped the leg with strips from a flour sack and told me to stay off it as much as I was able. "Foss and I will handle the stock," she said. "I'm not going to sit in the house for 2 days," she said. "You said yourself, 2 days to know whether it worsens." I looked at her. "You're giving me my own words back." "Yes," she said. "Are they wrong?" "They weren't," I said. "Fine." She went back outside. Those 2 days were some of the worst days of that winter for reasons that had nothing to do with the leg. I was never a man who could sit still well. I had 40 years of training in being useful, and the legs are a fundamental requirement of being useful on a working ranch, and mine was propped up on a chair telling me to stop moving. I sat at the window and watched Nora and Foss move through the morning work, small figures in the distance crossing from the barn to the corral to the water trough, and I was useless in a way that wore at me like cold water. Being waited on and worked around and provided for, there is something in that is very difficult for a certain kind of man, not because he can't accept kindness. It's because to accept it requires him to acknowledge that he needed it. And a man who has spent 40 years working his own place without needing much of anyone doesn't carry that acknowledgement easily. He's built himself around not needing it, and you can't pull that particular brick out without the rest of the structure noticing. I trusted her. That was what I found myself turning over those 2 days in the chair. Not a plan or a decision, just the recognition, slow and plain, the way you recognize something that has been true for a while without your formally admitting it. I trusted her with the cattle and the barn work, and the daily judgment calls that a working ranch requires. The kind of judgment that you don't explain because you can't fully explain it. You just do it right or you do it wrong. I trusted her with the place in a way I hadn't trusted anyone since Decker, And with Decker it had taken 3 years. With Nora it had taken, I counted back, 3 months. On the third evening she came in late, after Foss had already turned in. She'd been quiet since supper, a different quiet from her usual quiet, not distant, just inward, like she was turning something over. She sat down across from me. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." "When I asked about work in January," she said, "it wasn't only practical. I waited. I'd been walking west for 3 months," she said, "telling myself it was about getting to my sister, and it was about the money situation, and it was about starting something new, and some of that was true." She looked at her hands on the table. "But I was also walking because I didn't know what to do with myself in a place that was staying still. After my husband died and the farm went, everything I'd been doing stopped making sense as a thing I was doing for a reason. And the walking made sense because it had a direction, even if I wasn't sure about what was at the end of it." The fire in the stove shifted. Cutter was against my good leg. "When I saw the light in your window," she said, "it was 2 in the morning and I was cold and I needed shelter. That was real. But I also thought, there's someone else up at midnight on Christmas Eve with a candle in the window. There's someone else who hasn't stopped doing the thing even when there's no one to do it for. I thought that meant something." "It meant I had a spare room," I said. The corner of her mouth, just the corner. "I know," she said. "But I stayed because it felt like the first place I'd been in 3 months where living was still happening. Not just going on, actually happening. You work this place like it matters. You care about it not from habit, or not only from habit, from something else. And I'd forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere where that was true." I didn't say anything for a moment. "It's still happening," I said. "Yes," she looked up. "I know, I can see that. I'm telling you where I am. I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for anything you haven't offered. I'm just done with not saying things." I looked at the window. No candle tonight. But the lamp was in the glass, a shape of gold against the dark. "I've been alone a long time," I said. "Not sure I have much left to offer." She gave me that look, the level one. "I didn't ask you for an inventory," she said. "I know. I was married 19 years and I said things and I lost things, and I learned that saying things mattered even when it didn't change what happened. So I'd rather say them." She paused. "That's all this is." I thought about Clara. I thought about the years between. I thought about the way time goes, and the way you don't know you've wasted a particular morning until the morning is 15 years behind you. "I'd like you to stay," I said. "Not as a hand. I mean, if you're willing to stay, I'd like you here." She held my look for a moment, straight on, looking for something and appearing to find it. "All right," she said. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Not dramatically, not with any weight of gesture. She just laid it there, the way she'd laid it on Cutter's side in January, the same flatness to it. The same plain statement of presence. "I'm here. I'm real. I mean it." I turned my hand over and held hers, and we sat there in the lamplight while the fire settled and neither of us said anything else, and there was nothing more that needed saying. She stayed. I want to say something honest about how that went, because I think men of a certain age and a certain experience have a version of this thing in their heads. The woman coming in from the cold, and it being easy, and it being simple, and the long years of loneliness dissolving like snow in April. I want to be honest. It wasn't that. It was good and it was right, and I'm glad of every day of it, but it wasn't easy exactly, not at first. I was set in my ways in ways I hadn't known until there was someone else living inside them. I'd built 30 years of habits, and I'd built them for one, and a second person living in that structure finds the places where it fits only one person very quickly. The way I kept the house, organized to my particular logic, which is the logic of a man who knows where everything is because he put it there and never had to ask, became a source of small friction when there was another person who kept things by a different logic. Not wrong, not worse, just different. She had her own silences, her own rhythms, her own way of deciding when a thing was done and when it needed more. We were two people of 50-odd years each, both of us seasoned hard, both of us with years of doing things our own way, and we had to find the places where our ways could live together without one of them winning and the other shrinking. There was a morning in April when we disagreed about moving the cattle to the north pasture. I thought the creek bottom was still too wet, the mud season not done, and I didn't want the weight of the cattle on that ground. She thought the spring grass in the north pasture was too good to leave, and she was right about the grass, but I thought the cost of it was too high. We argued it straight and with heat. She made her case and I made mine, and she looked at me when I was done and said, "I hear you," and then she went and did it her way. I was sore about it for a day and a half. And she was right. The ground was better than I thought, and the grass was as good as she'd said, and the cattle came out of it fine. And she didn't say anything about being right. That was not how she operated. She was right, and she knew she was right, and she'd done what she thought was correct, and that was the end of it. No gloating, no "I told you so." That's a particular kind of strength that is rarer than it sounds. We were married in August. In town, with Foss and the pastor and a few of the neighbors who would have been annoyed to hear about it after the fact. Margaret Hendricks cried, which she apparently did at weddings regardless of which particular wedding it was. It was not a large affair. Neither of us was a large affair kind of person. She wore a dress she'd made herself from blue cotton bought in town. I wore my good clothes, which I'd pressed the night before for the first time in several years. The pastor said his words, and I looked at her, and she looked back at me with those direct dark eyes, and I thought, this woman came out of a blizzard. This woman walked through a blizzard on Christmas Eve and knocked on a stranger's door because she saw a light in the window. And now she is at my side in a church in August, and she is here because she chose every step that brought her here. I thought about all the ways it could not have happened. She could have been a little further east and missed the road to my place. She could have found shelter at Dellard's. She could have taken the train in November instead of walking. I could have been a man who didn't leave a candle in the window. I could have let the door knock go unanswered. I'd thought about it for a moment, I'll admit that. Thought about just sitting still in the dark and letting whatever it was go away. I opened the door, she knocked. The valley in August is a different world from the valley in December. The grass is high and the creek runs easy, and the hills are a deep green that gets dusty at the edges in July. And by August the cattle are fat and slow-moving, and the mornings come pink and warm. I'd loved this place in August for 30 years, and I'd loved it alone, and now I loved it with someone beside me, and there is a difference. Not that the love was less before, it was what it was, and it was real. But it's a different thing to look out at something beautiful and have the person beside you see it too. We had supper outside that summer. Not elaborate supper at the work table. We moved out to the yard on the evenings. The heat was too much for inside. Foss would eat with us on those nights, and sometimes talk and sometimes just sit with his coffee and look at the last of the light, and we let him. A young man is easy company when you're not asking anything of him. He left us at the end of September, moving on the way young men move on, and I said come back if you need work, and he said he would, and he meant it, I think. And that was fine. Just us after that. The two of us and the cattle and Cutter and the unnamed cat and the valley going into October and the light changing the way it does. I want to tell you about something that happened that fall. Not dramatic. One of those small things that carries more weight than it has any right to. We were in the barn late in October, doing the last of the fall sorting before the cold came. Moving the dry cows to the south pasture and keeping the close ones near the barn, a job that takes most of a day and all of your patience. Nora was working the far end of the sorting pen, and I was at the gate, and we'd been at it for 4 hours. There was one cow, a blue roan I'd raised from a calf, and that had given me good calves 3 years running, who was carrying twins, which I hadn't known until late September when the vet happened by. Twins are trouble. Two calves means half the resources and twice the chance of one of them being weak, and the cow herself spends more energy carrying and delivering two than one, and it takes more out of her. I'd been watching her closely. She wasn't moving right. I'd been watching her for an hour, the way you watch a cow when something isn't quite what it should be, when it's below the threshold of alarm but above the threshold of nothing. Nora was across the pen and she'd been watching the same cow, I realized, because she looked up at that moment and across the pen at me and said just with her chin, a small gesture toward the cow. Like, you see it, I see it. That's all, a look across a pen, a chin gesture, the shared knowledge of a thing neither of us had put into words. I'd had that with Decker once or twice, in 8 years. I'd had it with Clara, yes, in 11 years of building and working together. And I'd had it now with Nora Enns, who had walked in from a blizzard 10 months before and was standing across a sorting pen from me on an October afternoon, seeing the same thing I was seeing. We moved the cow to the close pen, apart from the others, and watched her through the afternoon, and that evening she dropped one calf, a healthy heifer, and then an hour later dropped the second, a bull calf that was small but breathing well. Both of them on their feet by midnight. The cow was tired, but she was all right. Nora and I took turns checking on them through the night. I'd do the midnight check and she'd do the 3 in the morning, and when she came back from the 3 o'clock she came and told me both calves were nursing and the cow was down but resting easy. And then she went back to bed and I lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular except that this was a good life. That was all. This was a good life, and I was living it. That Christmas, I set the candle in the window the same as I always had. Same tallow stub, same iron holder that had come from Ohio in Clara's hands. I set it at dusk, and I sat down in the chair across from it. Nora came and sat in the other chair. She didn't ask if it was all right. She just sat. We were quiet. The fire was up and the room was warm and Cutter was under the table and outside the snow was coming down fine and steady, the good kind, the deep winter kind that doesn't blow. The flame was steady. I thought about Clara, same as always. I thought about her hanging the curtains. I thought about the 23 years of sitting alone in that same chair with that same candle. I thought about a woman walking 4 miles through snow because she saw a light, and knocking on a door because she decided it meant something. After a while Nora reached over and put her hand on the arm of my chair, just on the wood close to my hand. I moved my hand and covered hers. The candle burned. She said after a while, "What was her name?" I looked at her. She was looking at the candle. "Clara," I said. She nodded. "She had good taste in customs," she said. I looked at the candle again. Small flame. 24 years of it now, counting this one. A woman in Ohio had started it, and a woman in Illinois had carried it west, and a man alone in a valley in Colorado had kept it going because he didn't know what else to do with a window that needed something in it. "Yes," I said. "She did." We sat there until the candle burned down on its own. I didn't blow it out this year. I let it go until the last of it was gone and guttered, and then I sat in the dark with Nora's hand in mine, the fire in the stove putting a little light in the room, the snow coming down outside. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I didn't move. The dog sighed under the table. After a while I got up and put more wood on the fire because the cold was starting to come off the window, and I looked back at her as I did it and she was watching me. That direct look. That look I'd been learning all those months, the one that said, "I see you." Not a performance of seeing, just the plain fact of it. You are worth watching. You are worth sitting with in the dark on Christmas Eve. You are mine and I am here. I put the wood on the fire and I went back to my chair, and she reached for my hand again, and we stayed there until the room was warm. I was 59 years old, and there was snow outside, and it was Christmas. And the woman beside me had chosen to be there, had walked through a blizzard and knocked on a door and stayed on through a hard winter and said plainly what she wanted, and made something out of the two of us that neither of us had managed alone. I've been asked since, what made the difference? Why this winter? Why this woman? Why did I open the door that particular night when I might not have? I don't have a complete answer. I was 59 and I had been alone for 23 years, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical tiredness of the work. A kind of tiredness that lived underneath the work, deeper than the stove could reach, older than any particular cold. And she saw me, not who I'd been, not what I'd had once. She looked at what was actually there, the man in the chair in the house in the valley in 1902, and she decided that was worth staying for. That is not a small thing, and I am not going to pretend it is a small thing. A man can do everything right and still be nobody to anybody. He can work hard and keep his word and maintain his place and be decent to the people he encounters, and still go to bed at night in a house that is only as warm as the stove keeps it, and only as lit as he left it. And the years go by, and the years go by, and the candle burns down every Christmas Eve, and the new one goes in the same spot, and the window is always the same window with the same dark outside it. Until it isn't. She knocked. I opened the door. The light meant what she thought it meant. After all, room at the table, come in if you're cold, somebody here. 23 years I'd been leaving that invitation, and I didn't know if I meant it or if I just couldn't stop doing the thing Clara had started. But on Christmas Eve of 1902, somebody came to it. And she was worth the wait. Every year of it, every cold night in the chair, every time I blew out the candle alone and went to bed in the dark, every morning I woke up and the house was only mine, worth it. I don't think the world gives you things because you need them. I think the world mostly doesn't care. I think you work and you hold on and you keep going, and sometimes, not often, not reliably, not on any schedule, something happens. And in that moment you have a choice. You can stay in the chair and let whatever is outside the door go away, or you can get up. I got up. That's all there is to it. That's the whole story. A man left a candle burning every Christmas for 23 years, and one year a woman saw it, and he got up and opened the door. And from that night on, the window looked the way it was supposed to look. A light inside and two people behind it, and a long winter ahead that neither of them had to walk through alone. Let me go back a little. There are things I left out that belong here. I left out the first time I rode into town with her, which was about 3 weeks after Christmas, when the road had cleared enough for the wagon. I needed feed and hardware, and there were a few things she needed as well, and Foss was minding the place, so we went in together. Riding into Colden with a woman beside me was something I hadn't done in 23 years. I want to say that and let it sit for a moment. 23 years is a long time to do a thing the same way, and then one day do it differently. The road is the same road, 12 miles of frozen mud, with a corduroy section through the creek bottom that always rattled the teeth, and 2 good stretches of open plain where the horses could move at a good pace. I'd driven it 1,000 times, but I was very conscious of the seat beside me being occupied. She sat the wagon seat the way she sat everything, straight and without fuss. She'd put on better clothes, a dark wool coat that was an improvement over the thin one she'd come to my door in, and which she'd replaced with money from her first month's wages. She had a hat that was a woman's hat, not the working hat she wore at the ranch. She looked the way she always looked, which is to say entirely like herself, not trying to be anything else. I was aware of her the way you become aware of something you've been looking at for a while without officially looking at it. In town, I tied the horses and we went our separate ways for a portion of the morning. I had business at the hardware, and she had business of her own at the dry goods and the apothecary. I was at the hardware for a good 45 minutes, dealing with a dispute about the cost of a particular grade of wire that had gone up since fall, and when I came out and went to find her, she was at the dry goods with Margaret Hendricks. I could see them through the window before I went in. Nora at the counter and Margaret behind it, and Margaret talking with the animation she always had, and Nora listening with that steady, direct attention she gave to most things. I could see Margaret gesturing, asking something, and Nora answering, and whatever she said made Margaret laugh, a genuine laugh, head back, not polite. I stood there on the boardwalk for a moment outside the window and watched this happen. It was a small thing. I know it was a small thing, but I felt something when I saw it, when I saw her making Margaret Hendricks laugh in the dry goods on a January morning. This woman who'd come to my door from a blizzard 6 weeks before and was now standing in my town at my dry goods with my neighbor. I felt something that I couldn't immediately name. A warmth, maybe. A kind of rightness, like watching something find the place it was supposed to be in. I went in. Margaret said, "Holt, I've been getting acquainted with your Mrs. N's." She said it with a particular emphasis, not unkind, and she was looking at me with her sharp eyes and a smile that meant she had opinions she wasn't going to voice in public. Margaret Hendricks had tried twice to find me a woman in the years after Clara, and had eventually given up, and I expect she had feelings about the fact that one had found me instead of the other way around. I said we were glad to have met, and we got what we needed, and we went back to the wagon. On the road home she said, "Your neighbor is a character." I said that's accurate. She said she told me you were the most solitary man in the valley. I thought about that. I said that's probably also accurate. She said she seemed pleased you weren't solitary anymore. And then she looked out at the road ahead and didn't say anything else about it. And I didn't either. And we rode the 12 miles back in the particular comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill the space. There was a day in February, different from what I told you before, a different day, earlier in the month, when I want to be honest about what I was feeling, because I think I've been making it sound simpler than it was on the inside. I was in the north pasture repairing a gate, alone that afternoon, Foss doing something else and Nora in the barn. It was one of those February afternoons that is still and gray and cold without being actively miserable, just quiet. The kind of day that doesn't ask anything of you except to do the work in front of you, which I was doing. And I found myself thinking about what I was doing, not the gate, about what this was, what I was building, or what was being built without my having decided to build it. A woman in my house, a woman at my table, a woman who knew the names of my cattle and the location of the good wire and what temperature the stove needed to be at to keep the kitchen comfortable at night without burning through too much wood. I'd been alone for 23 years and I'd made myself good at it. That's the only way to put it. I'd taken the loneliness and the silence and the particular dailiness of a life built for one, and I'd made it into something I could live. I'd packed it in tight and learned its weight and carried it so long I'd stopped feeling the weight of it. And now something was changing, had been changing since Christmas, and I was standing in the north pasture in February with my hands on a gate I was fixing, and I was realizing that I was afraid. Not of her, not in any sensible way, just afraid of hoping for something that could be taken, afraid of building towards something and having it go the way things had gone before. Clara was 36 when she died. She was vital and able, and she died in 3 weeks from a fever. The world doesn't protect you from loss just because you've had it once already. I'd learned that. I'd learned it from the inside. And there was another thing which I had a harder time admitting. I wasn't sure I had much worth offering. I was 59. The ranch was running well, but it was a hard life, a good life, but hard. I wasn't a young man with fire in him and years ahead. I was a man who'd built something in a valley and stayed with it and been broken by it and rebuilt and stayed again, and I was still at it. But I wasn't the man I'd been at 28, not in body or in the brightness of everything. What did I have to give a woman of real quality and her own strong will? I fixed the gate. I went back to the house. Nora was in the barn still, and when I came in from the cold to the kitchen, the stove was warm and she'd left coffee on it for whenever I came back. That small thing, she'd left coffee on the stove for me, not knowing when I'd be back, Just it would be there when I came in. I stood at the stove with my cold hands around that cup and I thought, well, there's your answer. This is what it looks like. This particular small warmth. I should tell you about my son. I had a son named Thomas, born in 1873. He was a good boy and he grew up on this place, and when he was 22, he went to Denver and then to California, and he sent letters for about 2 years and then the letters stopped. I don't know where he is. I don't know that he's alive. That is a weight I carry that is different from the weight of Clara. Clara I know what happened to, and there is a terrible peace in knowing. With Thomas there is only the not knowing, which is its own thing entirely. I told Nora about this in February, one evening when we were talking after supper, one of those conversations that finds its own direction without being steered. She'd asked about the room I'd showed her when she first came, the sewing room, and I'd said it had been other things before, and I said one of them had been a boy's room, and she'd let that sit for a moment, and then she'd asked if I wanted to tell her about him. I did. I don't know why I did. I hadn't talked about Thomas in years. There was no one to talk to about him, and talking into air doesn't help. But I told her about him growing up on the place and being good with the cattle, better than I'd expected, and then wanting something else, something I didn't have here, which I'd understood even while I'd felt the loss of it. About the letters. About the last one, which had come from San Francisco and said he was working on the docks and doing well and that he'd write again soon, and that had been 1897. She listened. She didn't offer comfort about it, which was right. There's no comfort for that kind of not knowing, and she seemed to understand that. She just said, I hope he's all right, in a plain way, and I said I hoped so too, and we left it there. But after that she would sometimes, not often, and not in any way she'd have called doing it on purpose, she would say something about Thomas in passing, the way you mention a person who is real and present in the fabric of things. She'd say something like, if Thomas comes back, he'll find this place in better shape than he left it, just in passing, not making a thing of it. Or she'd be in his old room doing something and I'd hear her moving around in there without her treating it as a room to avoid. She kept him real. That's what I mean, without making a project of it. She just kept him real in the ordinary way of a person who understands that the people we're missing don't stop being part of us because they're gone. Clara, Thomas. They were the two gaps in me that I'd arranged myself around, the way a river goes around a stone, still moving, still going forward but shaped by what it can't go through. Nora didn't fill those gaps. That's not what I'm saying. But she understood they were there without me having to explain them, and she moved around them with the same care she moved around the cattle in the pen, knowing where the room was and where it wasn't, and that made a thing possible in me that I hadn't known was waiting. I want to tell you about the spring. February turned to March and March was the leg, and then March turned to April and the mud came the way it always comes, which is enthusiastically and all at once. The roads went to muck, the creek bottom was a problem, the cattle were restless after the winter months in close quarters and wanted the grass and would make a mess of anything soft-footed in getting to it. April is my least favorite month in an average year, and in 1903 it was average in that respect. But the evenings were different. This is hard to put right, so I'll just say it plain. The evenings in spring on this piece of land have a quality that I never found anywhere else. After a day's work, when the light is going long and golden over the hills to the west, and the cattle are out, and the air smells of mud and new grass, and the cold edge of the north wind is finally gone, there is a quality to that light and that air that makes the world feel exactly as large as it should be and not 1 inch larger. I'd felt that alone for 30 years. I felt it that spring with someone beside me. We'd sit on the south side of the house after supper in April and May, not doing anything, just sitting, watching the light go. She'd bring her coffee and I'd have mine, and Cutter would be at our feet and the cattle would be shapes in the middle distance and the creek would be running high and loud from snowmelt. We didn't always talk. Often we didn't. That was all right. That was good, better than good. There's a thing about quiet that changes when there are two of you in it. The quiet is the same quiet, same valley, same light, same creek, but you're not alone in it, and somehow that makes it bigger rather than smaller. Like the silence can breathe more because it isn't holding you up by itself anymore. She said to me one evening in May, sitting on the south side in the last of the light, that she hadn't thought she'd have this again. She didn't say it with grief. She said it the way she said most things, plain and direct. She was looking at the hills. She said, I made my peace with not having it again, and then this happened, and now I have to unmake the peace and find the other thing, and it's harder than it sounds. I understood that precisely. I said so. She looked at me when I said it, with a look of recognition that is its own small warmth. I know you do, she said. The summer went the way summers go on this land, fast, hot, dry in July. The cattle pushed to the creek meadows for the water, the hay cutting in August, the days long and full and ending in the particular exhaustion of summer ranch work, which is a different animal from winter exhaustion. Winter exhaustion is cold and deep, bone-tired. Summer exhaustion is hot and satisfied. You've been out in the sun and the heat all day doing the work that builds the year, and you come in with it all over you, and you eat and you sleep, and you get up and do it again. We worked well together in the summer. She had ideas about the ranch, not corrective, not saying I'd been doing it wrong. She had ideas about things that might work better, rotations and fencing and a small kitchen garden that she put in on the east side of the house in May, and which by July was producing more than I'd expected. She brought it up the first time tentatively, the way you bring something up when you're not sure of your footing, and I said go ahead, and she did, and she was right about most of it. I changed the way I rotated the south pasture on her advice, and it made a difference by the end of summer that I could see in the cattle. That's a practical thing, and I'm going to say it practically. She knew cattle and she knew land, and she had ideas that were worth taking seriously, and I took them seriously, and the place was better for it. That is also its own kind of love, maybe, respecting someone's mind, listening to them, letting them change how you do something because they know something you don't. I'd been running this place for 30 years by my own light, and I'd run it well, and there was pride in that. Setting pride down long enough to hear someone else was its own act of trust. She'd earned it. There was an evening in July, heat of summer, the air thick and golden, and the smell of cut hay from the south meadow coming through the kitchen window, when we were finishing supper, and she was quiet, and I looked at her and asked what she was thinking. This was a question I rarely asked because I'm not by nature a man who asks that question, but I was learning to, slowly. She said, I've been thinking about my sister. I said, and? She said I should probably write her, tell her what happened, she'll have been wondering. I said, probably. She said, I don't quite know what to tell her. I thought about that. I said, tell her the truth, tell her you stopped. She looked at me, just that, a look. And then she smiled, not the corner of the mouth this time, a real smile, quiet and full, and she said, I suppose that's exactly what happened. She wrote the letter that week. Her sister wrote back in September, a letter that took a while to arrive and which Nora read at the table with a quiet look on her face, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and didn't say anything about it right away. Later, a few days later, she said her sister was glad she'd stopped, said she'd been worried. That was all she said, and I didn't press it. But I noticed she wrote more letters after that, not a flood of them. Just she had more people in the world after a while than she'd had when she came to my door, which seemed right to me. A person of her quality should have more people than she'd had. We had one bad night that fall that I want to tell you about, because I've been telling you mostly about the good things, and that's not the whole picture, and I said I'd be honest. It was October. We'd had a dispute, not about cattle, not about the ranch, about something more personal, about the way I went quiet sometimes. I had a habit, from the long years alone, of retreating into myself when something was difficult, going into a kind of interior silence and not coming back out of it until I'd worked whatever it was through on my own. That had been necessary when there was no one else to work it through with. It became, she told me, a wall when there was someone on the other side of it. She said it plainly. She said, Holt, when you go like that, when you just close, I don't know what to do with it. I can't tell if you're angry with me or angry about something else or what it is. It just feels like a door going shut. I was quiet for a moment, which was probably not the best response at that exact moment, and she made a short sound and stood up from the table and went to her room, which had stopped being the spare room by then and was just our room, but she went in and she closed the door. I sat there for a while. Cutter looked at me from under the table, reproachful in the way of dogs. The honest thing was that she was right. I had gone quiet, and I had known I was going quiet, and I'd done it partly because what I was turning over was something about feeling seen too clearly, which is a strange thing to admit. She knew me in a way that felt new and complete, and sometimes I turned away from it slightly, the way you turn from a light that's a little too bright for your eyes. I went and knocked on the door of the room. She said, come in. I came in and I sat down on the edge of the bed, which was Clara's old bed and was now ours, and I said, you're right. I do that. I go somewhere when things get hard, and I don't come back out until I've dealt with it on my own. I said it was a long habit and I wasn't sure I could just stop it, but I said I could try to tell her at least when I was doing it, so she'd know it wasn't her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that would help. That was it. No great resolution, no sweeping of things under the rug, no performance of forgiveness. She said that would help, and I said I'd try, and we both understood that trying and succeeding are different things, and that we were in the business of the long work, not the quick fix. I'm still not perfect at it. She'd tell you that if you asked her, but I'm better. You can get better at things if you try, and if the person on the other side is patient enough and honest enough to tell you when you're failing. That's what she was, patient enough and honest enough, both in the right proportion. That Christmas Eve, our first one, the one I was building toward all along, there is a last thing I want to tell you about it before I let it rest. After the candle had gone out and we'd been sitting in the dark for a while, I said, "Are you cold?" And she said, "A little." And I put more wood on the fire, and then I stood there at the stove for a moment with the heat of it on my face and looked back at her. She was sitting in the chair in the dark, her face in the low glow from the stove, and she had her hands folded in her lap, and she was just there, present, real. A woman in a chair in a house in a valley, the same woman who had knocked on that door a year before out of the blizzard dark. And she was here because she'd kept choosing to be here, day after day, through the hard winter and the muddy spring and the hot summer and the turning fall. And here she was at Christmas in the chair that had been empty for 23 years. I thought, you are the answer to a question I didn't know I was still asking. I didn't say that. I'm not a man who says things like that out loud, but I thought it, and it was true, and I'll say it here because this is the place I'm telling the whole of it. She looked at me across the room with that look of hers, level, direct, warm in the way that doesn't perform warmth, just has it, and she said, "Come sit down." I came and sat down. She put her hand in mine, the stove ticked, the dog sighed. Outside the snow was still coming down fine and silent, the good deep winter kind. We sat there until it was very late, and then we went to bed, and that was Christmas. I am 67 years old as I tell you this. Nora and I have been married 8 years. The valley is the same valley. The cattle are different cattle, generations of them, the calves of the calves I had when she first came. Cutter is gone these 3 years. His successor is a young dog named Grit who has more energy than sense but is coming along. Foss came back 2 years ago and has been with us since, and is becoming the kind of hand who will run a place of his own one day, if he doesn't move on first. We never heard from Thomas. That's still there, same as it was. I don't carry it differently than I used to. You don't get to put those things down. But I carry it with someone beside me, and that is different in a way I don't have words adequate to. She is still herself, straight and direct and able, with her own views and her own way of working and her own silences that aren't mine. We still disagree. She was right about the North Pasture in April of 1903, and she has been right about a number of things since and wrong about a few, and I have been right about some and wrong about others, and we've made a life out of that back and forth. A real life, not a comfortable lie. On Christmas Eve, I still set the candle in the window. I've never considered stopping. Nora sits in the other chair and Grit is under the table, and the snow comes down the way it always does in December in this valley, and the flame burns. I think about Clara, same as always. I think about what she started and why she started it and what it's meant. Room at the table, she'd said. Come in if you're cold. There's a light here. She was right about that. 24 years later, I know she was right. I left the light on. Someone came to it. I opened the door. A man could spend a whole life in a valley alone and not know what he was missing. Could do the work and keep the place and go to bed at night and get up in the morning and never have a woman look at him. The way Nora looked at me in March when I couldn't walk and she put a split on my leg and said, 2 days. Could never know what it was to have that room charged differently. That silence weighted with another person's breathing. Could never know what it was to be chosen, plainly, by someone who had no obligation to choose him and chose him anyway. I would have been all right. I want to be honest about that too. I would have been all right without her. I was all right before her, in the way of a man who has survived and continues. But all right is not the same as this. This is different. This is better than all right by a margin so large I can't see the edge of it. I set the candle in the window every Christmas Eve, and every year she comes and sits in the chair beside me. We don't make a production of it. We just sit there in the dark with the flame between us and the valley outside, and the snow comes down the way snow comes down, and the world is what it is, and we are in it together. That's the story. That's all it is, and it's everything.